We talk about leadership all the time today in many different parts of our lives: business, family, religion, politics, many others as well. We might as well start with a definition, although many people would say they recognize it when they see it, and it's one of those things that is hard to define. But for our purposes, we'll call leadership the ability to influence a group toward the achievement of a vision or set of goals. So the group is being pushed or pulled by the leadership influence. This can be coming from a formal position or a non-sanctioned emergent role, that is somebody who develops within a team to lead that team. You may see that in your group projects sometimes. We can look at some characteristics of a leader. I've got a selection of leaders here, some of them looking not quite so leaderly as they might otherwise do. I'm sure you recognize all of these people. If not, we got Bill Gates in younger days up in the left, and below him Nikki Haley, both looking pretty leaderly. In the middle, we've got Vladimir Putin, apparently not looking quite so leaderly, and George Bush. And then we got President Obama playing with his lightsaber. And lastly, our new Pope, Pope Francis. These people aren't leaders if they don't have the ability to influence others, if they aren't sanctioned by followers. In this case, that means followers agree to follow them. The followers are giving away some of their decision-making power to the leader. They exist in a goal-oriented aggregate, and they are a symbol of that aggregate. Of course, the people that I chose are very symbolic of the particular aggregates that they either led or currently lead. Today, we focus a lot on leadership competencies, so I wanted to talk about that for a moment. There's three specific categories about competencies, things that you ought to have in order to be a leader. So there are competencies around leading the organization, leading yourself, and leading others. This is a very long list, so we're not going to talk about all of these. These are generated by the Society for Human Resource Management, which of course is very interested in defining competencies for a variety of jobs and a variety of types of work. So leadership is no different. Here we're talking about leading the organization, and as you can see, there's some key topics that we're talking about in our course and that you might expect to be associated with leadership ability. So to the extent that you can do these things, one would presume that you have more leader qualities. People recognize you as being a leader and you're more effective. So change management, problem solving, managing politics, being able to be creative and deal with a risky environment, vision and strategy, managing the workflow, and enhancing other skills, and finally understanding and navigating the organization. If we look at the self, leading the self, we also expect there to be a significant issue around self-control and demonstrating certain types of qualities that we'd like other people to demonstrate as well. So being ethical and displaying that drive and purpose, both of those things are partially about getting your followers to do the same. Exhibiting leadership stature. Do you act like a leader in different contexts? Sometimes we can look at something as trivial as how somebody is dressing, and we can see that in fact they are not exhibiting that stature. Should that mean anything? It's not clear, but we know that it does. We should look at our own capacity to learn and develop. We should manage our own emotions, behavior, etc. We should be aware of ourselves, our emotions, our behavior, how we come across to other people. And, of course, be more adaptable as our environment becomes more changeable. Lastly, in terms of competencies, leading others, the main competencies. So communicating effectively with other people, being able to develop other people, and working with diversity and difference in an effective way, developing relationships. This is something that we've come to believe is more important than ever today for a variety of reasons. And lastly, managing effective teams, because of course we use teams more than ever these days. As if this was not a large enough list, the Society for Human Resource Management also has a list of global leadership competencies. And if you can think of anything else, I'm sure we can add it on there. To be a good global leader, we would expect that you need to be more open-minded and flexible in terms of how you approach things and what kinds of tactics you use. Cultural interest and sensitivity, those are two different things. One is, I'm actually interested in people who are from different cultures. And I'm sensitive to what they believe or think or how they might come to a particular decision or how they might interact with other people. We know that being interested in something is a motivator, and that presumably is going to make you a better leader in a global context. Needless to say, globalization has made business a lot more complex, so your cognitive complexity or your ability to deal with complexity is important. And then we also know that things tend to go wrong in complex environments. So being resilient, coming up with different ideas, being resourceful, being optimistic, and having high energy, of course, are all things that we would all like to have. Maybe we have some of them and maybe some of them we don't. When we get to the end of this segment, we can talk a little bit about how we might develop these properties in general. Over the years, people have looked at leadership from theoretical avenues that started with basically a universal type of view. I've got the guy holding the world in his hand, meaning, if you're an effective leader in one situation, you can be effective in any situation. And this was based on what used to be called, of course, the great man approach to leadership. So we can take General Patton and we can put him as the head of a corporation, or we can take General Eisenhower, who was a great general in World War II also, and we can make him president of the United States, and he's going to be great in that role. Well, in the case of Eisenhower, we get to actually see that that wasn't so great. Eisenhower thought that one of his major roles as president was to play golf a lot. So in some cases, we might think that universal approaches are going to be lacking something. So that leads us to contingency approaches, leadership effectiveness, depending on the situation or the contingencies faced. We'll give a couple of examples of both of these types of generic approaches, universal and contingency approaches, not in too much detail, but just briefly so we can get the idea. Trait approaches started in the 1930s, essentially, when people started thinking we can measure a whole bunch of traits that might enable us to select managers from a bunch of people. So I'm going to have you sit down in a classroom, take a paper and pencil test, and those of you that meet the test's demands are going to be passed on to leadership roles. So we look at people's properties that are somehow unique, these personality traits that are either inborn or learned very early, determination, flexibility, and energy, etc. And we think that these are going to be the things that help people in any leadership situation. In fact, our research does show us that there are some traits that are universal. So extroversion, conscientiousness, openness, emotional intelligence, all are related to leadership, particularly its emergence. That is, if you weren't a leader to begin with, you may emerge as one if you have those traits. Thinking about it from a behavioral standpoint, this was a big shift, of course, that was driven in part by a huge growing need for more managers and leaders, and also changes in society in the U.S. around the later 1940s, when everybody had an opportunity to go to college, or most males did, because they had served in the military, and the GI Bill allowed them to do that. So the idea here started to be that we could train people to do the behaviors required for leadership. There are two primary behavioral clusters. They're all about people and task. And this distinction comes back over and over and over in various parts of management. Preferences by employees may vary across cultures. That is, what I want my manager to do may vary depending on what culture I come from. But these are still the same clusters that we see everywhere. Problems with universal approaches: these lengthy lists of traits and behaviors aren't always consistent. When no leader is assigned, different leaders can emerge based on the task, and leadership seems to vary somewhat to the extent of the situation, so we want to consider situational characteristics as well. Here's an example. We're not going to go into this in detail, but Hersey's situational leadership theory, which is a contingency theory of leadership, says that leadership should be a function of not only what the leader does, right, but the leader has to look at what the follower is like. So follower performance readiness is based on their willingness, which is basically motivation, and their ability. So this was how Hersey and his colleagues thought about contingencies. What were followers like? And that should drive leader behavior in an effort to be effective. So here's employee readiness. So if we go from right to left, we can see we're moving from low readiness to high readiness based on how unable and unwilling or able and willing we might happen to be. And if we look at this from a leader behavior standpoint, we can see we can graph it out. We can look at what types of behavior could the supervisor use to manage the different types of people. So if you look on the axes of this diagram, you can see that supportive behavior, which is around the people aspect, right? Remember we said task and people turn out to be important dimensions. Supportive behavior is around the people aspect, and directed behavior on the x-axis is around the task approach. I'm not going to go into this in detail. What we want to think a little bit about is the basic premise. That is, if you have subordinates that don't know what they're doing, you're probably going to treat them differently than if you have subordinates that are very expert and highly motivated. So as you can see, the chart actually shows you some different possibilities in terms of the combinations of highly directive and highly supportive and so on that might be useful with different subordinates. So if you are interested in that, obviously you can look a little bit more at it. Here's something else that we've thought about more in recent years, transformational leadership. I don't know how many times I've heard somebody say, well, we need a transformational leader or we need a charismatic leader to do this. Those two things are a little bit different, but we'll focus on transformational leadership. Basically, this is thought to be comprised of things like being able to consider your people as individuals, providing them with intellectual stimulation, that is, opportunities for growth, being an inspirational motivator, and providing influence that's idealized, that is, I can act and demonstrate myself as a model that my subordinates should look up to. Transactional processes, of course, are when I give you some, something and you are going to do something in return, right? Or you do something and then I'm going to reward you somehow. Why do we emphasize transformational leadership over transactional? Well, if we want to enact change, get more than expected performance, produce changes in actually who the employees see themselves as, then we're going to really need some sort of transformational leadership. Transactional leadership essentially gets people to make micro changes in their behavior. We think that transformational leadership can get larger changes in behavior to occur. So how do you become an influential leader? Here's some things that we can do and some things that we've tried to do in various contexts. How do we acquire these competencies? If we focus on skills, this is behavioral, so we figure it can be trained, and that's why we're going to take that tack. If we think about personality or style, you're looking at your subordinates and you're thinking always about their personality. That person is lazy or that person is a go-getter. That's not actually going to be nearly as helpful. And if we think only about the cognitive part of the curriculum, like what we're doing right now, I'm telling you stuff and you're reading about it in your book, that's less helpful too. What we want to do is hands-on skills development. So basic steps, we want to assess through surveys. We want to figure out how people are doing. So you and your subordinates can have their skills assessed through assessment center vehicles, role plays, surveys, etc. For example, take an emotional intelligence test and determine your strengths and weaknesses on understanding yours and others' emotions. We want to understand the principles that underlie the basic concepts of leadership. So traditional cognitive learning about what emotional intelligence is and what behaviors display it would be helpful. We want to analyze our skills by using case studies. So we see in a case study, here's somebody who tried some things that were either positive or negative in terms of emotional intelligence. We analyze why they do or don't work in that context, and we start to begin to understand how all of these pieces fit together. Then we can skill practice. So using exercises or role plays, we can try and demonstrate the correct behaviors. I'm using emotionally intelligent behaviors here as an example, of course. To adapt your style, get feedback on success, get feedback on the things that you didn't do as well, and pay attention to it and try and change. And lastly, try and apply it in a real world situation. Reflect on and evaluate your success. See how it's working for you. If it's not working for you perfectly well, are you supposed to throw it out? No, you go back to some of these other steps that we've gone through before. Okay, so some summary points. We need to know what the competencies and behaviors are that demonstrate leadership. We need to understand the basic contingencies, like what are my followers like, that tell me that behavior has to be changed. And we need to learn and practice our leadership skills.